Hello, and welcome to Politics and Prose Bookstore. My name's Sarah, and I'm a bookseller here at Politics and Prose, where we host a range of in-store events along with classes and trips. Before we get started today, I'd like to ask you to please silence your cell phones so as not to disrupt the event. And when we get to the Q&A portion, please line up at the microphone over there to ask your questions. Tonight, I'm very excited to welcome Steve Wasserman, celebrating the release of his memoir, Tell Me Something, Tell Me Anything, Even If It's a Lie. Steve Wasserman holds a degree in criminology from UC Berkeley. He is a publisher at Heyday and was previously the deputy editor of the op-ed page and opinion section of the Los Angeles Times, editor of the Los Angeles Times Book Review, editorial director of New Republic Books, publisher and editorial director of Hill and Wang at Farrar, Straus and Giroux, and of the Noonday Press, editorial director of Times Books at Random House, and editor at large for Yale University Press. Steve will be joined in conversation with Marie Arana. Arana is a prize-winning author, literary critic, and the inaugural literary director of the Library of Congress. She is the author of the book American Chica, which was a National Book Award finalist for nonfiction. Her other titles include Cellophane, Lima Night, and the biography Bolivar, American Liberator. Arana currently sits on the boards of Penn Faulkner, Penn America, and the American Writers Museum, and the Board of Governors of Northwestern University. She is president of the Authors Guild Foundation, as well as president of the 150-year-old Literary Society of Washington. So now, without further ado, please join me in welcoming Steve Wasserman and Marie Arana.
Good evening. I am absolutely thrilled to be here sitting next to this gentleman. We've known each other for, gosh, I hate to say it, but it's been about 30 years, Steve. Yes. It's been 30 years. We are partners in trade and also competitors in trade at various institutions, and we have shared so much life together. We've been around the block in the same ways. We've both worked for publishing houses. We've both worked for newspapers, book review sections. We have done just about everything, but on different sides of the coast most of the time. And it's just a thrill to be here with my friend, my colleague, and just a wonderful, wonderful editor and writer. Now we know how good a writer he is, apart from his being an absolutely remarkably talented editor and keeper of the gate, I would say, of good books, good writing, good authors. Steve, welcome.
I'm so thrilled to be here at Politics and Prose. For the nearly 9 years, I edited the Los Angeles Times Book Review, while Marie edited the Washington Post Book World. Neither publication exists today, which is part of what motivated some of the essays in this book.
Actually, Book World Washington Post was just revived.
Revived, okay.
Okay.
So I believe in Easter. I believe in the resurrection. So hopefully it will take on life after death. This will be a good reason to celebrate. And our resumes might suggest, rather than a golden romp in an unfolding and serendipitous career, it might actually suggest that we couldn't hold on to our various jobs for very long, and we're determined to work every station in the publishing kitchen before we were done.
But you have to admit, we have seen an incredible run of books in the last 30 years, whether you've been editing them, Steve, as both of us have, or reviewing them, which is a very different side of the universe, the book universe. How was that, moving across that sort of red line of creative work and critical work for you?
How do you mean exactly? You mean...
Well, I mean, when you're creating a book, you basically are, first of all, you're working on a long manuscript. It takes a very long time to actually birth a book and bring it to its best self. But it's also, you know, when you get to the critical side, and I found this, I was all for the authors, and you can't be all for the authors when you're running a critical magazine. You've got to be pretty strict about your views and about your expectations for what is lasting and enduring and good.
Well, I would guess I would compare it to the pleasures and challenges of, let's say, Neolithic man having to go out and hunt the mastodon. That takes certain skill to bring home the meat. And then it's another kind of skill to carve it up and cook it. And then there's another kind of appetite for the eating. And the reviewing and the literary criticism is the eating and the digestion. So I hold with with Alice Waters of Chez Panisse fame.
Very gastric story.
Very gastric. Just to make this crystal clear, she often has championed that the best kind of meal is the one that is composed of the freshest ingredients and that they're not overcooked. So if you're a literary critic and are putting together in a weekly section devoted to trying to choose this or that book for attention, you want to try to have some sense that the ingredients that went into the making of this book were fresh and original, not tired and sad, but that they brought something that would surprise the reader. And I just found it just such a exuberant way to think about ideas as they circulate in the culture, and to put together, as it were, your ideal dinner party week after relentless week, marrying a book to a potential author, and then letting the reader decide whether or not they agreed with this or that opinion mattered less to me than, in an ideal world, a review of a particular title might help a reader examine their prejudices, turn themselves inside out, and, with luck, see the world with fresh eyes.
Well, you're absolutely right. They're both about writing, and they're both about good writing, and they're both about analysis and beauty in a way. I mean, there is a certain beauty to the perfect book review. There really is. But you know, more than that, you've been around the block also as a cheerleader for reading and writing, and I'm here as the wonderful founders of the American Writers Museum are sitting right here among us, and you know, lifting up an institution like that by giving it the first blurb, the first really vote on behalf of the museum was yours. And so that is work too. I mean, holding up the culture.
Well, I've often thought of myself, if I had any talent at all, it was as an impresario, a kind of impresario of literature, in contrast to what the late Ed Doctorow once said of me, and I haven't repeated this very often, but I will in this audience. Ed Doctorow, E.L. Doctorow, the wonderful writer, once visited me. We had lunch at the Los Angeles Times, and we knew each other a bit. And he came by, and he came to my office, and he saw my office, which had stacks and stacks of galleys of books being sent to me by publishers who hoped that one among their number might be selected to be reviewed. And he looked at all of these books, and he visibly shuddered, and then said to me, "Wasserman, you're the Mengele of literature."
Oh dear, oh dear. Oh dear Ed, he was such a wonderful man.
Yes, he was a wonderful man. So, you know, it was a position that did carry some weight in the culture. There being so few newspapers that bothered to devote serious newsprint to the review of books. And but I was always devoted to what I would call literary hygiene also. that one should not go after an author for base or shameful reasons, but sometimes there was a book that was so egregious that you couldn't avoid it without trying to examine its presumptions, hopefully tethered to a larger point about what might be going awry in the culture. And that was an important thing to do. But the basic enterprise was to bring to the reader books that were famously the news that stays news. And it was a joyful occupation to do, and I remember those days with great fondness. And there is in this book, Tell Me Something, Tell Me Anything, even if it's a lie, a long, it's a 10,000 word essay called Goodbye to All That, which I try to honestly reckon with what I saw on the inside of a mass circulation major metropolitan daily as it struggled to try to get its sea legs and figure out how to engage with its readers and provide the news that stays news, particularly in a place like Los Angeles, where so many people think that the brains of the inhabitants have been baked by the relentless sunshine that no one actually reads, except to decorate their mid-century modern homes with books as wallpaper. But the truth of the matter was, as I quickly learned, that there were many years in which the greater metropolitan Los Angeles region outsold the greater New York metropolitan region in per capita books, and thus it inspired us to found something 30 years ago next year, the Los Angeles Times Festival of Books, which attracted upwards of 150, 160,000 people over a 2-day weekend who recognized each other in this balkanized place called Los Angeles as members of the same tribe, devoted to reading and trying to make sense of the past, trying to understand the present, and trying to figure out through the works of writers what our collective and individual future might look like.
Well, of course, LA has bred many writers, many wonderful writers, as you know. But the fact is that to be a good writer, you have to be a good reader. I mean, there's no MFA that's going to give you that. So you end up at the end of a career as a reader and a fixer and a sort of a keeper of the gate by birthing books, an ability to write yourself. And this is a great testimony to your having worked in the field for so long, because this is an absolutely brilliant, entertaining, and quite, in many places, funny and entertaining book.
I can't tell you how pleased I am that you noticed the humor, because I remember a job interview I once had at the New York Times. I was so often mistaken in Los Angeles from being from New York that at some point I had to embrace my fate and actually move there, which I did. But in my attempt to wriggle out of underneath the suffocations of Los Angeles for the alleged pleasures of New York, I arranged a job interview at the New York Times, and I sent them my clips. This was in 1980, 81. And I remember the interview, and the fellow interviewing me said, "I've read your clips." He said, "You write well, but you write very seriously about serious things. And what I'd like to know is, do you have a sense of humor?" It's like one of those questions like, when did you stop beating your wife? It's an unanswerable thing. And I said, well, what makes you ask? Because, now that you mention it, I guess I do write about some serious things with some seriousness. He said, well, you see, we here at the New York Times try to leaven the news with some levity.
Thank you for laughing.
So I have been depressed by this verdict rendered on my writing ever since, feeling that, maybe I'm just too solemn, and maybe I need to lighten up a bit. And so when some colleagues of mine, when we were putting this together, said, you know, you have actually written quite amusingly about that, and why don't you leaven some of this? Why don't you put those things in? And I've been very pleased to see that the early notices have remarked upon what they flatter me to call the palpable wit. So if that could be engraved on my tombstone, I will die laughing.
I like everything about this book. I mean, I like the cover. I like the end papers. You know, we don't often have end papers. I've never had end papers like this. The whole book is just beautifully done. But what I like about it is that it's a memoir, Steve, yes, of you and your works and your experiences, but it's also uh, a memoir of the trade itself, in a way. It's a memoir about a lot of writers, and in very, very different ways. And so what you've done is it's almost a story of a family, as opposed to the camera is not on you, but it is on you because it shows your taste, your experiences, your extraordinary relationships. I mean, these are warm relationships. These are deep. You're not just, you know, editing, blue lining a manuscript. You are actually involved in their lives. You go with them to, with Barbara Streisand to her talk at Harvard. You go, you accompany Susan Sontag on, you know, tagging around at parties because she wants your company, and you know, you engage Orson Welles, and I mean these are extraordinary names and extraordinary people in the culture, the American culture, but you show them in very different. My goodness, your portrait of Jackie Onassis, you know, with her 4 scallops and she only eats 3, and she tells you. She talks to you about where the country failed, you know, and it's astonishing because it's really about them and you in the midst of them.
Well,
Was that on purpose?
not entirely. Yes, I once played stupidly with the thought I might title this book Name Dropping, a memoir in essays. But that would be to do myself a disservice. I have been very fortunate to encounter very considerable people along the way, and even to work with many of them. And the stories I have tried to tell in this book around some of those people, I hope are tethered to a larger point. Um, you know, for Jackie Kennedy, I was very briefly,
You were her colleague,
I was her
not her
colleague
editor.
at Doubleday. For a nanosecond, I was the executive editor of Doubleday. And she was a very well-regarded editor at Doubleday. She had published all kinds of things from the Marquis de Custine, memoir of 19th century Russia, to Michael Jackson, and 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 memoirs by dancers and others. And um, we hit it off very quickly, and she was a person of remarkable intelligence and discretion, as she needed to be because she was leading and had been leading an extraordinarily public life. It startles and dismays me to remember that she died nearly 10 years younger than I am today. Um, and But when we went to that lunch at Michael's restaurant in New York, and I selected a table not in the the main dining area of that restaurant because I just thought it was that she needed to have more privacy. So we went into the part of the restaurant that is thought to be Siberia, and she was very grateful for that. And we started talking, and at one point we abandoned the chit chat, and she looked at me and she put her arm hand on my forearm and said in that very breathy voice that she had, she said, "Steve, where did it all go wrong? And then answering her own question, she said, it was Vietnam, wasn't it? And then quickly we were on the slippery slope to talking about Arnold Schwarzenegger, whom, had married into the family, whom she allowed, and she very rarely, if ever, said a bad word about anybody. But with me, she said, I have to tell you, I detest everything that man stands for. And suddenly we were having the most interesting, complicated conversation, which really quite left me breathless. But anyway, I hope in some of these stories that I'm telling them, again, as I say, for a larger reason. And what the book really is, the through line, at least as I experience my own book, is the story of someone like me, as it turned out, who is seeking to invent himself, inspired and inspirited by others who I admire for their passionate engagement in the world, for their efforts to, however modestly, help repair our broken world and leave a lasting contribution as I fall through time and circumstance, hoping against hope never to do the thing that we used to argue into the wee hours of the night when in college, hoping never to sell out. How can you make a life that is an ethical life that avoids aesthetic shallowness, that avoids the Philistinism that so marks and deforms our culture, and make your way in the world and do something, however modest, that, as I say, contributes to the good? That for me is the story. And above all, in terms of publishing, working with writers, essentially becoming a midwife to the birth of ideas by others more talented and more gifted than I felt I was, and then trying to answer the question, a single question, which in no matter what job I was fortunate enough to occupy, was the question that had, in my judgment, to be answered, which was, how do you cut through the noise of the culture and get attention for deserving work?
That, of course, is the real work at hand, isn't it? It's a breakthrough with something new. And it's a joyful work. I mean, it's something that birthing books is just an extraordinary act in itself, because you have to understand, you have to be able to invade somebody's mind and see their best self, and bring it out and bring it forth and keep it pure, and not impose too much of yourself. There's wonderful conversations between, there was a wonderful documentary between Bob Gottlieb and Robert Caro that actually, now I'm going to name drop myself, but that I actually did at the Library of Congress, and that was then made into the documentary, that conversation, which is it gets at the relationship between an editor and a writer. And an editor, I think, is part friend, part a confessor, part rabbi, part judge. And so you are all of these things, and you end up almost establishing lifelong friendships, I think, with your writers.
Yeah, no question. I've sometimes thought the work I've done has just been adding people to the, and this dates me, to the Rolodex. Now, of course, as I enter my dotage, I see there are a lot of names in that Rolodex that are no longer with us. But of course, out of sentiment and sentimentality, I refuse to prune it. But in the end, I too will join the Encyclopedia of the Dead. So I hope to leave a little memento behind, which is, of course, this book, and which I thought, if I don't do this now, it won't be done. So this is the first book that I've authored over the last half century of, as I say, helping to birth the books of others.
So let's talk about the people in it, because it really is quite. I mean, you go from someone like Laurie Anderson, who was sort of an avant-garde performer, to someone like Barbara Streisand, who is super popular performer. You go from someone like Christopher Hitchens, who was a hard-hitting, opinionated, absolutely marvelous writer, orator, speaker, to someone as as tender as was it Joyce Carol Oates is in this book, or is she on the
No,
back
Joyce
of the book?
Carol Oates.
She's on the back of the book.
She was kind enough to give me a blurb for the book. I know her. I never published her. I never edited her. But I sent the manuscript to a number of people that I never represented or published because one must seek the praise of others. Hopefully, names others yourselves might recognize and say, well, on the recommendation of this good person, maybe I'll give it a try. And to my great pleasure, about 6 or 7 very esteemed writers said very kind things. So I felt I'd passed my orals.
You did indeed. Well, you know what emerges from this book, and you do emerge from this book in a very subtle way, is a firebrand young man, who makes friends or is taken under the wing of Tom Hayden. And there is this extraordinary portrait of the left at the time, the 60s and the 70s, which are so formative in your life, formative in mine as well. But we meet Frances Fitzgerald, we meet Vivian Gornick, we meet Tom Hayden, we meet Chris Hitchens, we meet all of these people who really spoke for and shaped the left in many, many ways. You were in the junior high school going out and beating the bushes, trying to get people politically.
Well, the opening line of this book is "Geography is fate," and I'm forever grateful to my parents, Bronx-born, but who came to the West Coast in 1952, my mother pregnant with me, and ultimately by 1963 settled in Berkeley, California. And I'm forever grateful that they settled in Berkeley and not Orinda across the hills, because geography was fate. And a year later, the free speech movement broke out. I was 12 years old and very quickly swept up into that vortex of people who were seeking to make history. And they were very heady times. So I found myself going to the second Vietnam teach-in that was held in May of 1965. And there were lots of people who spoke, from I.F. Stone to Norman Mailer to Senator Wayne Morse to Bertrand Russell, who piped in from London on a live feed his remarks. And suddenly I was, as the late...
You were 14 years old or 15 years old.
Yeah. I was 13 in 1965, 14 the next year in 66 when the Black Panther Party was founded. And by 1969, I was trying to put out an underground high school radical newspaper, which Bobby Seale, who I had befriended of the Black Panther Party, allowed me and my fellow mischief makers to use the party's typesetting machines for our little rabble-rousing paper. So I was swept up in all of this, and then later, when I was introduced to Susan Sontag, I found myself living in her penthouse apartment in the summer of '74. I was working with Robert Scheer, who'd hired me as a researcher for a book he was writing. He was the former editor of the muckraking Ramparts magazine and had written the earliest, if I'm not mistaken, the earliest pamphlet against the war, published in 1965, called How the United States Got Involved in Vietnam, turned down by more than 24 publishers in New York. But anyway, we were we went to New York to put the finishing touches on this book. He was living at Jules Pfeiffer's pad on the Upper West Side, and I had met Susan Sontag and her son, David Reef, that spring at Scheer's home in Berkeley. We became fast friends, and I'll never forget when Nixon resigned on August 8th, 9th, 1974, this was before computers, it fell to me to go over the page proofs and change all the tenses from present to past, as in Nixon was, and I assure you that no task so tedious was ever so pleasurable. So I had a front row seat to these people, and I just graduated college, and I'm at Susan's apartment full of her then 8,000 books. She would possess and have read 25,000 when she died in 2004. And I remember getting a kind of crick in my neck looking at the titles and feeling much abashed because while I had just graduated college, there were many authors I'd never heard of. There were other authors I'd heard of but had never read. And then for reasons wholly mysterious, I found my hand drawn to one of the 4 blue-backed volumes of the great French writer André Gide. And in his journals, I found the following quote, which I have tried to live up to ever since. You call me a young firebrand. He confides to his journals in the late 1920s. He has a sentence which Susan had underlined, which was, "I know I shall have grown old when I awaken and no longer feel outrage." And I thought, oh yes, that'll give you a moral compass that will keep you on the true north. And I've tried to live up to that. I hope age has not diminished my temptation to become a firebrand.
I can just imagine you because one of the, I mean, as a young man, you joined a force of what was it, like 1,000 young people who went to Cuba to work in the cane fields to produce the sugar that Castro needed to actually prosecute his revolution and build the country in the way that he wanted to. You were one of those kids who went to Cuba, and therefore, and therein, is this title of your book. Could you tell that story?
Over the last 54 years, I've been to Cuba maybe a dozen times. I first went, as you rightly say, as a member of something called the Venceremos Brigade, which was a conspiracy by the New Left to put together a number of fevered radicals who might do what they could to assert the constitutional right of American citizens to visit any country that would have us, and also to express our solidarity with the right of the Cuban people to shape their own history and to break the American blockade. So I very quickly fell in love with the people of Cuba and its culture. And this piece is a kind of, I put everything I have ever known, learned, or felt into this piece. Again, it's another 10,000 word. It's one of the longer essays. And really what it is the story of a love affair gone bad. Cuba, for me, is a heartbreak. And I have lived both vicariously and in part participated in elements of that love affair and watched it curdle into something by turns quite ugly for a variety of reasons, some imposed by outside forces, many of them, but others self-inflicted wounds. 54 years ago, I met a Cuban poet named Pablo Armando Fernandez. And he was living under the Batista years in exile in Manhattan on Pomander Walk. 1959 occurs, and he casts his lot with the new dispensation, returns to Cuba, and is very quickly become part of a very important band of Cuban writers that included Gabriel Cabrera Infante, Gilberto Padilla, and others. And very quickly, they are the nucleus and establish a literary weekly supplement published by Revolucion. It was called Lunes. It appeared on Mondays. It only enjoyed an 18-month run and was shut down by Castro in an infamous confrontation at the National Library of Cuba, in which Castro declared within the revolution, everything. Without the revolution, nothing. Well, who was going to be the arbiter? It was a little bit like you were in Plato's Republic, in which the poets get banished, right? So, and after much rum on a beach in Cuba, the 40-year-old Pablo Armando Fernandez turns to the 17-year-old Wasserman and says to me in very dulcet tones, "Tell me something. Tell me anything, even if it's a lie." And wow, I thought, even at the time, what a great line. And I thought, and ever since I have treasured this line, hoping that maybe if one day I had the talent of a Chekhov, I would write a short story, or maybe a novella with that as the title. Or maybe, and this is what actually came to pass, it would be the title of a piece that would render a kind of verdict on this experiment begun with such idealism in 1959. And just to make the long story slightly longer, although I always think it's important that a title should contain a kind of mystery which you, the reader, should figure out. But for me, what it means, Oscar Wilde once remarked that he trusted no man whose dictionary did not contain the word utopia. As I've grown older, I trust no man whose dictionary boasts the word utopia, because there never was such a place, and there never will be such a place, because we are members of a species who, as a great philosopher once observed, we are the broken timber of humanity. Yet, and yet, how do you live without certain kinds of myths, even lies that you tell yourself, without which you can't strive in an optimistic way to fashion the future that we would all actually like to live in? So I play with this notion throughout the book, and it is, for lack of a better word, it felt to me like the red thread that connected many of the occupations. There's a chapter on Germany and its discontents. Well, in an evil way, what was National Socialism about? You know, an attempt to fashion a kind of dystopia or utopia. So I have a chapter on the art of the Russian avant-garde, people like Malevich and El Lissitzky, that I wrote originally as a review of a phenomenal and stunning exhibition mounted in 1981 at the Los Angeles County Museum of Art. And I was very moved by both the art as well as the fates of the artists who created this work in the 1920s and a little earlier, but who fell victim to Stalin for the most part, and either were banished, killed outright, driven into exile. But they thought they were creating a universal aesthetic language that would champion, that ordinary people would champion. And they were looking forward to establishing a kind of Gesamtkunstwerk, a way in which art would inspirit all of society. And they suffered a double tragedy. One, to have been persecuted by the Bolsheviks, whose dream they thought they were realizing, only to have their aesthetic principles rather easily severed from their ideological conceits and embraced by the West's capitalist advertising engine. And I stood there overcome with a kind of melancholy when I looked at these canvases and what they had sought to do, because I have been born into a time in which it is all but impossible to share the naivete out of which their great achievements were made.
Yeah. So you can see that apart from being a friend and a rabbi and a judge, he's also a philosopher. Let's dolly back a little bit, Steve, because I want to talk about American culture in the sense that there are universes within that greater universe. And one of those universes is Los Angeles. How you write wonderfully about LA and its culture and its great imagination and its great products, but it also its deficits and its short memory and its lack of attention and its. But tell us a little bit about how you see that part of American culture, the LA culture.
Well, I grew up in Northern California, so I shared all the conceits common to someone and prejudices common to someone who grows up in Northern California about Southern California. Southern California, in the view of the San Francisco Bay Area folk, was a kind of Sodom and Gomorrah. It was a place that had nailed itself to the cross of a kind of relentless and crude materialism, and it was thought to be a very shallow place. Actually, I later learned if you want the shallow place, go to Marin County. So I go down to LA in the summer of '77, a place, by the way, in which at that time, when you ordered a cup of cappuccino, they thought it was you just bring a cup of black coffee and you do the whip out of a can. You spray a little whip on it, and that's your cappuccino. Now it's hard to get a bad cup of coffee in Los Angeles, which is arguably the food capital of America. So I go to a place and I discover, to my great delight, something that was absolutely counterintuitive. There are 18 million people living between San Diego and Santa Barbara. But as I repeatedly say, geography is fate. So you go to LA, and in contrast to New York, LA is all horizontal and New York is all quite vertical. But I became convinced as I lived and worked there that if you were to take all the intellectual energy and artistic capital of Los Angeles and put it into an island no larger the size of Manhattan, suddenly the city would look quite vertical. And I found that the taboo in American culture one of the taboos, there are many, but one of the taboos that dares not speak its name is the ways in which, for better or for worse, Los Angeles and New York are increasingly coming to resemble each other. And the little engine that pumps people's ambition is very largely the same. The history of artistic creation, whether all along Southern California from, let us say, 1900, when there were only about a couple of thousand people in the great plain of and arid desert that was Los Angeles. The place now is palpably electric with grasping, ambitious people that embodies one of the great tropes of American culture and history. Susan Sontag once remarked of California that it was America's America. And by that, I took her to mean that just as many people immigrated to this country hoping to reinvent themselves and rid themselves of the burden of history, which weighed on the brain of the living, as was once said, like a nightmare, so too did many millions of people flee the industrializing pollutions of East Coast cities and come to California, this strange Arcadia that held out the promise that you could reinvent yourself. And many people did. And indeed, they created an industry called Hollywood, whose essential mission is to sell back to you the dreams of a more handsome, more beautiful, more enticing wonderland of play and of irresponsibility. And so the California, I know nobody talks about the Nebraska dream. They do talk about the California dream. So what does that actually mean? Is it a dream of endless prosperity kissed by the sun, where the end of the continent meets the Pacific Basin? But the underlying nightmare, noted by Brecht in his great Hollywood cycle, or by David Lynch in Blue Velvet, or in the whole creation, largely as a result of the aftermath of the Second World War in LA, called film noir, which then influenced the whole of French cinema. So there is a kind of grit to the place that is endlessly fascinating. And I found it to be full of complicated, interesting people. I mean, we land a mission on Mars. The dateline is La Cañada, the Jet Propulsion Laboratory. Einstein took a chair and an apartment at Caltech. If you were just to look at the archipelago of universities and think tanks, and even the archipelago formed by the bookstores, you would have to conclude this is a major metropolis, which should be taken more seriously. And I always measured a city's maturity by the degree to which it could wear without apology its neuroses on its sleeve. And for many years, Los Angeles and California in general, but Los Angeles in particular, was always anxious over its legitimacy, always and scratching at an open wound that never seemed to heal, which was its, and it had a kind of politics of grievance and resentment, always looking over its shoulder at New York. Now, hey, pick up the New York Times, pick up the Washington Post. Many stories, cultural and others, Dateline Los Angeles. No, Los Angeles wears its neuroses on its sleeve today without apology. It's a big grown-up place.
I have a California story that involves you, and it really, really endeared me to you, Steve. It happened a long time ago, maybe 20, 25 years ago, I don't know. I was coming out to,
We were just children playing in these fields.
We were just children. You were running the Los Angeles Times Book Review, and I was running the Washington Post Book World. And I was coming out to LA, and you said, "Oh, good, I'm going to take you to this fabulous restaurant." I can't remember the name.
Campanile.
Fabulous restaurant where all the stars go. And I said, "Oh, great, good." And got on a plane, got on a very early plane, 7 o'clock in the morning, whatever, because as you know, when you fly into California, if you fly out at 7, you're going to get there certainly by 9 in the morning. And I had an early check-in in the hotel, and I left in flip-flops, a ponytail, jeans, and a T-shirt. And I got to LA, and they lost my luggage. I had nothing. My plan was to go and get glamorous to go to this restaurant with you. And instead, there I was. So I called you up, and I said, "Steve, I can't go. I'm in a ponytail, flip-flops, and jeans, and a T-shirt." And you said, "Do you have a pair of sunglasses?" And I said, "Well, I do. It's in my purse." And he said, "You'll be fine." And indeed, when we walked into that restaurant, you swanned in. I mean, I was following you in my ponytail and flip-flops. Everybody turned to look at me because I had sunglasses on, and they figured anybody who would walk in looking like that.
But take a look at Marie. Sunglasses are not. This is one glamorous person here. Let's not kid ourselves.
I fell in love with Steve at that point.
And also, a mark of arrival in Los Angeles is to dress down. Only the most prestigious celebrities and producers can come dressed down. That is a mark of your success.
That's the difference between LA and Washington, D.C. So I lived in a very different universe where you wouldn't do that. But thank you. You introduced me to a California I didn't know.
Yeah. That restaurant, Campanile, is no longer there, sadly, on La Brea. But there are other restaurants that have emerged to take its place.
I'm sure. I'd like to open the conversation up to you. Please, if you have a question for Steve and his extraordinary career on all sides of the literary world, please step up to the microphone, which is right here, and ask your question.
And if you're too shy, I think you had a page or two you wanted me to read.
I do. While you're thinking of your question, yes.
So that would be catnip to me. I can't resist a captive audience. I hope to keep you captured in your seats, and you won't be, run away before this concludes. What would you like me to?
Oh my goodness! Read.
Did you have something in mind?
Something funny.
I can read something funny. Maybe a little tale about Christopher Hitchens.
That would be great.
Or would you like Orson Welles?
Orson Welles. Hitchens. Orson Hitchens.
You want the Hitchens? Okay. All right, brace yourselves. As Christopher might say, brace yourselves, brothers and sisters, countrymen, comrades. Just a little context. Christopher Hitchens and I met each other in October of 1979. I was on a trip to London. I was deputy editor of the LA Times opinion section. He was foreign editor of the New Statesman. I went to see, among the people I saw was Robin Blackburn, who had been an editor and contributor to New Left Review, which I had admired and been reading for some years. I went to visit Robin. We began talking, and about an hour or two into it, it was about lunchtime, he said, "Are you free for lunch?" I said, "Yes." He said, "Well, I know a really bad Chinese restaurant." By the way, that restaurant still it thrives in London. And he said, I have a friend I think you'd really get on with. His name's Christopher Hitchens. Why don't I ring him, see if he can join us?" Great. So Christopher arrives, and we go to the very bad Chinese restaurant. I remember nothing about the lunch except two things. Yes, the pot stickers were lousy. Hitchens was dazzling, and I fell in love. And from that began really a lifelong relationship. I published his first works here in the United States in book form. I introduced him to the woman that became his second wife, inadvertently breaking up the first marriage, but hey, everyone's got agency. I was holding his hand when he died at the too young age of 62 of esophageal cancer. I didn't always agree with everything he wrote. We had fierce disagreements over, as he liked to call it, America's intervention in Mesopotamia. We had argued to the wee hours of the night. It was I who suggested to him that he write a book against God. And he wrote a book called God is Not Great, How Religion Poisons Everything. Salman Rushdie cracked the title, God is Not Great, one word too long. Then there occurred this. So bear with me. Let me just find the chapter. Here it is. So this chapter is couched as a necessarily posthumous letter to my departed friend, in which it's Dear Hitch, and it afforded me an opportunity to be intimate in a way that another kind of approach in an essay in which the default position perhaps is to adopt a more Olympian pitch. This one I felt I could talk about things and tell some stories to evoke the man I knew in all his complexity and contradictions and attractions. So the book was published in May of 2007.
I'm going to hold that for you.
Oh, no, I can do it. I can do it now that I know my place here. And in the first week of his book's publication, the Reverend Jerry Falwell collapsed and died in his office, which fact alone almost disproved the entire thesis of your Jeremiad. And you were invited on the Sean Hannity show along with the Christian straight arrow Ralph Reed. Hannity asked what you thought of the late Falwell, and you bluntly allowed that you found Falwell loathsome in the extreme and called him a con artist, a grifter, and worse. Hannity became apoplectic and denounced your lack of respect for the dead man's family. You retorted that there was so little to Falwell that had he been given an enema before his expiration, he could have been buried in a matchbox. The blogosphere blew up. Thousands of copies of your book flew out of bookstores. It shot up bestseller lists everywhere, ultimately selling more than 500,000 copies, banned in Malaysia, which fact you were inordinately proud of. You were launched, and so was I. 5 months later, you were a finalist at the National Book Awards. A black tie ceremony was to take place at the Times Square Marriott Hotel. We gaily trotted off to the hotel. Soon we were engulfed by hundreds of folks crowding into the ballroom. Drink stations were scattered throughout the lobby. You were encircled by admirers. Keen for a bracing drink, you asked Carol, his wife, and me to see if we could get one. 20 minutes later, the lines were long. We made our way back, drinks in hand. We were called to our respective tables. Dinner was served. The awards were announced. First prize was denied. You hid your disappointment well, and we repaired to the Lowell Hotel where you were staying for a nightcap. No sooner had we entered your room than my BlackBerry, as one had in those days, began to thrum insistently against my thigh. I read the message with disbelief. An astonishing story had just been posted on Gawker. Turns out that while Carol and I were busy getting drinks, you had been approached by a young couple who wanted to know more about a screamingly funny column you just published in Vanity Fair. It described in painful detail and laugh-out-loud hilarity your attempt at self-improvement by having a Brazilian wax job administered by the woman who was said to have invented the procedure. You got the works: back, crack, and sack. It was, you wrote, almost as excruciating a torment as being waterboarded, which in the interest of participatory journalism, for the benefit of Vanity Fair's readers, you had also endured. How, the woman wanted to know, did you feel now? Smooth, very smooth, you said. And seeing the look of disbelief on her face, you invited her to judge for herself. She was game, and so right there, in the middle of the crowd around you, you unzipped your fly. She put her hand in, lingered, and then withdrew. You looked at her and deadpanned, and the verdict? Smooth, very smooth. Then, spying the incredulous look on her boyfriend's face, you invited, don't take her word for it. You're welcome to check for yourself. After the briefest hesitation, the boyfriend said he thought he would. The hand went in, the hand withdrew. You said, and? Smooth, very smooth. The evening had barely ended when the couple posted their encounter on Gawker, and suddenly the internet had lit up. You, for your part, had said nothing of this to either Carol or me. I drew Carol aside, showed her the story on my BlackBerry. She read it quickly and said with what seemed to me loving exasperation, "Oh God, you can't take him anywhere. What a bad boy he is."
Wonderful, just wonderful. Questions? Oh, come on. No questions?
Malcolm, rather.
To the microphone, please, Malcolm.
Well, first of all, Steve, I wish we could go on all night, and I hope you give thousands of interviews because you are so engaging and you have so many wonderful stories. And just started to read your book, and I said, what a wonderful way to sort of go back in history. And, I started in the early days of California. It all starts coming back, but it's not reading a history book. It's reading it as portrayed by you so wonderfully. So thank you for that.
Thank you.
And I just, as an editor and as a reviewer, writing is so hard, and people work so hard to get a book published, maybe years of work, and then maybe it gets picked and it gets published, and then they get a negative review. And when I read a negative review of a book, I cringe. And I say to myself, why review a book and give it a negative review? Why pass it and not put the author through that agony? Curious on your take on that.
That's an incredible question.
Yeah.
Yes. Worries all of us on the business, I think.
Well, the business of rendering a literary verdict should be done with a rigor and a unsentimentality in the interest of the reader, not in the interest of the author. Authors send their work out into the world. The world is a big place. Sometimes they'll find their ideal readers, sometimes not. I remember Martin Amis, the late Martin Amis, once wrote a one-sentence review that was actually published in a British journal, which only the Brits could get away with this. His review was, "This book is so bad, I couldn't even begin to read its first sentence." Now, I'm not for that kind of review. That's kind of a schoolboy's taunt. And nor am I for a gratuitous, egregious, snarky attacks on writers. Yes, writers labor long and hard. But I do hold with the late Elizabeth Hardwick, who in the opening manifesto that announced the establishment of the august New York Review of Books, said that we are going to treat books, and if there are books whose intervention in the culture is itself so egregious or wrong-headed, we have a responsibility to call it out, and not to ignore it. If you think there's a larger cultural thing at stake, and I certainly held to that. I once published a book by the late Dominic Dunn, John Gregory Dunn's brother. It was a fiction based on the Menendez brothers' trial, and it was reviewed by a very fierce critic that I asked to review the book, who had also written a novel called, and perhaps this was alarming, called Resentment, a Comedy, to review the unfortunate Dunn. Suffice to say, he didn't like the book. Dunn, for his part, was outraged. And I arrived in the office on the Monday following the Sunday publication to a very angry fax in which he accused the reviewer of having an animus toward him, that it was a prejudicial review, it was not done in good faith, and moreover said I was an accomplice to this, and not only was I an accomplice to this, it was the evil hand of Leslie Abramson, who had been one of the Menendez brothers' chief defenders, because he asserted, not wrongly, that Leslie Abramson's husband, Tim Rutten, was a longtime employee of the LA Times who presided over the opinion section and op-ed page for whom I had once worked, and that we were in cahoots, and this was a terrible plot. So I did something that I rarely do. I was friendly with his brother, John Gregory Dunn, and Joan Didion, John's wife. So I called up John and I said, I received this angry letter from your brother. What would you advise? And he cackled with glee. And he said, oh, Steve, this is so delicious. He said, well, the first thing you should do is you should print the letter in full. Because anytime a writer of my brother's diminished stature sends you for free and you don't have to pay for it, it's box office. I would ballyhoo the letter on the front page of the book review. And how would you recommend I respond? And he had advice. He said, oh, you should just quote the good Dr. Johnson, who said in these matters, and here's the quote you should use. Thank you for your letter. In these matters, I hold with the late Dr. Johnson, who once said, fame is a shuttlecock, which to be kept aloft must be batted upon both ends. We did that. Further enraging Dunn, who then went down the street on East 48th Street, where the gossip columnist Liz Smith lived, and made his charges as an item he hoped she would retail in her column, which was syndicated in about 600 newspapers across the country. And so she did, because Dunn was a friend. Whereupon Rutten, who is subjected to this calumny that suggests or accuses him of a kind of journalistic corruption, and he had nothing to do with the Commission of the Review, felt that his reputation within the LA Times was at stake and maligned here. So he enlisted the services of a very good libel lawyer in Los Angeles, who immediately sent out a letter and FedExed it to about 500, cost a pretty penny, demanding that Liz Smith admit error and take it all back and apologize publicly and all of those things. Otherwise, they were going to sue. And Liz Smith amazingly collapsed and did run this correction. And it was quite a little victory for Rutten. So, so I do believe in thoughtful, sometimes fierce reviews or considerations that hold or call authors to account. And I particularly encourage them if they are a form of literary hygiene.
There's an answer.
Didn't Joan Didion have a fabulous answer to a review?
Oh, Joan Didion was famous for, yes. She reviewed a book for the New York Review of Books, and very critical of the book under consideration. We'll wrap this up in a second. Very critical, long review, and the aggrieved author wrote to take issue with her review, and his letter was about as long as her original review. It was about 1,200 words, and basically he said there was nothing accurate in your review but the spelling of my name. Everything else, your characters, everything else was completely wrong-headed. And Bob Silvers, the editor of the review, dutifully ran the whole complaining letter, but he gave reviewers the right to respond. And so the response was, Joan Didion replies, "Oh, wow," period. Victory to Didion.
That reminds me of the time that Kitty Kelly sent a headless fish in a shoebox to Jonathan Yardley because of his review of, I think it was Frank Sinatra's book, and quite a negative review. But we are finished, ladies and gentlemen, and I want to invite you to come and have your book signed by Steve. It's a wonderful book, and you shouldn't miss it. It is, it will keep you entertained for days. It's just lovely in every sense. Steve, congratulations.
Thank you so much, and thank you for being in conversation. And thank you for your attention and coming to Politics and Prose. I came here with my children many times to Politics and Prose. It's a special place.